Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics. I'm Anita, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan.
Thanks, and glad to be here.
Trump's plan to end the Russia-Ukraine war heated up with Wednesday's call to Putin. With Ukraine and Europe sidelined from negotiations, can this administration bring about a lasting peace that both sides agree to? Also hot are Trump's trade wars, which include a directive to impose reciprocal tariffs on all countries. How practical is this plan, and what will it achieve? Finally, most of U.S. foreign aid is frozen, and the agency that distributes much of that aid, USAID, is being dismantled. How will it affect national security?
So how are you feeling about the new golden age?
Oh, it is so much fun to be a federal worker right now. We just started our return to office. Not that our work is there, but because they want us to be miserable. So I know my office mate and I, our meetings are both at the same time or something. It's very difficult to have meetings, see students when we're sharing offices, have to be there all the time, which wasn't an issue before. Of course, anything with the word women's or anything like that is canceled as part of DEI. And let's see, they want our commute to be terrible as everybody goes back to work. They just want us to be as miserable as possible. Guidance on speech in the classroom and on personal social media. Everybody's worried about their job. I have a friend of mine who canceled a roundtable that was titled something like Challenges Faced by the Incoming Trump Administration, because just feared that could bring unwanted attention. And so lots of fun.
Yeah, but you're seeing this as the opportunity. I mean, as the Office of Personnel Management hijacked by Doge put out, I mean, you're in a very low productivity, lazy bunch of workers. You should welcome the opportunity to join the private sector in a high productive role within America, right?
I mean, I think we want productive and high quality workers in the government to carry out some of these really important missions in national security. And, I feel like it's important in some way to be teaching the future military leaders and civil servants, even though now everyone's declared to be the enemy of the people. And the military is being affected by this too. My office mate told me that he was like, look, I've served 3 combat missions. I know 100 people that have died, and this is how I'm being treated. This is how my service is being appreciated.
Yeah, no, that's a real powerful statement. So, I mean, where do you see this all heading from what you can tell of the master plan out there around Doge, around DEI, around what the Secretary of Defense has said so far?
I mean, the master plan is just to get rid of as many people as possible. I don't know what they want the end result to be other than a lot less people, less departments, and less projects. I know everyone is busy dotting their I's and crossing their T's. So everything's being careful about being able to justify everything in our budgets. And like I said, everybody's careful about what they're saying to keep their jobs. I'm a little bit more vocal than some people. I think Trump would have to dig down to find this podcast, but you never know with Doge's efforts these days.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you got big balls on the case. So, I mean, those algorithms can dig deep, I'm sure, and match up names with social media, no matter how obscure. So,
yeah,
you never know.
But I refuse to be this person who is going to be so careful to never offend dear leader.
Well, we've already put enough out there. I think that there's going to be a strong case against that. And certainly the basis of getting rid of an employee based on a loyalty test or First Amendment kind of expressed in their private time is kind of sacrosanct. So it seems like you'd at least have a legal case if you were targeted specifically for political speech, which is free.
You would, but proving it would be the difficult part, I think. But who knows? I mean, right now they're just firing the easiest workers, which probationary workers. Not that they've done that in my institution, but they've done it across.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything specifically around with the Department of Defense or within military education that's been announced regarding targeted reduction of force or status of probationary workers?
Yeah, not yet. We were just told that they are compiling a list of names of probationary workers. Probationary workers are people who've only been hired in the last 18 months to 24 months. I'm not exactly sure where that cutoff is. And so they're compiling the names. So no one knows if that means that they'll be let go or if there'll be less trying to tear down the Department of Defense. I mean, I know it would be a huge issue for us because how are we supposed to teach these students if we don't have instructors? Already, we've lost our USAID instructors, and that's caused a lot of havoc.
In terms of just people having to step up and take over courses like midway through a term.
And then I think at least a couple people in faculty and definitely some people in operations took the deferred resignment.
The fork in the road. Yeah.
The fork in the road where they resigned to get paid until September.
Okay, so some people did take that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's off the table now, but some people got in under the...
Yeah. I don't know how many people. I just know of a handful.
Gotcha. Yeah. But no changes at this stage in terms of the curriculum itself and the focus.
Not so far. Fortunately, not so far. But it's just a really tense environment. It seems like there's a new thing that drops every single day. And so it's just very, very frustrating. So I've also put in a lot of time in my game, Civilization 7, which just came out.
Okay.
Because when I'm playing that, I'm not thinking about what's happening to my job or the federal government. I'm having some success at trying to be the richest and most armed civilization. Although my money has gone down because I keep trying to have to buy happiness from all the places I've taken over.
Well, it's a shame that Elon cheats so much on games instead of actually dedicating to the grind like a real true gamer like yourself. Otherwise, maybe he wouldn't have as much time to to dedicate to Doge and
destroy the government,
his business's personal political enemies.
Oh, and it's so ridiculous, too. Some of the employees that got let go were from the Department of Energy, the ones overseeing the nuclear arsenal. So after they were let go, several of them had to be lured back because they realized the importance of what they're doing. You know, Doge is supposed to be so superior in technology and, you know, targeting the right organizations, but obviously they're not. They're not being careful in what they target. They're not being careful in what programs that they destroy or preserve. And it's really scary. That's why I keep playing Civilization.
Yeah, that's understandable. Yeah, it is kind of an interesting combination that Doge ends up being the instrument for Project 2025. Because, I mean, essentially a lot of what they're doing, the idea of shrinking government, of punishing bureaucrats, of making them miserable, that was the plan as the current head of OMB, I think Russell Vought, a major contributor to Project 2025. So it's like this combination of Elon's personal kind of retribution towards certain agencies that either gave his businesses or personal activities increased scrutiny, or it's just this idea of punishing the bureaucracy and shrinking the federal government as much as possible, as was outlined in Project 2025. So you can see why there's like this consensus, even though these are kind of pretty disparate groups and people, the ability to use Doge and Elon as this wrecking ball for Project 2025.
It's really pretty unprecedented power. And I know like in the beginning of all of this, it was really, a lot of us kind of naively felt like it wouldn't affect PMEs, professional military education, that much. You know, probably all the DEI stuff or anything that looks possibly like DEI would go. But to see like how far down they're going to make sure that everyone's miserable in every situation is, if not surprising, not totally expected.
Yeah. Yep.
So I guess we can move on to the Russia-Ukraine war and other efforts that Trump is making throughout foreign policy.
Yeah. So, I mean, this one actually took a while. I was expecting this to come up within like the first week or two.
Day one, he was going to end the war.
Well, yeah, of course. He had the day one promise that he was going to end the war. That did not come to fruition. And frankly, the first 3 weeks are really his new kind of neo-imperialist, speaking of civilization, where, he seems fascinated with 19th century gunboat diplomacy and the era of William McKinley. So we had lots of conversations on the Panama Canal, on Greenland, whereas I think one representative, when in Congress, proposed to call it red, white, and blue land.
Seriously? I missed that one.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And then, of course, the constant harassment of our neighbor to the north, Canada, which is now, interestingly, beginning to tighten up their election. It looked like the Liberal Party there, where Justin Trudeau has resigned, was just going to get absolutely destroyed in the incoming election. And now, because of the anti-Americanism that Trump has encouraged through the potential takeover of Canada, that the polls have tightened to within 5%. It was like a 20% lead by the Conservative Party over Liberals, and now it's just a 5-point lead. And I think the head candidate in the Conservative Party is really struggling, because before it was like, oh yeah, of course you go 100% US, 100% MAGA. But now, it's the people in Alberta, around Calgary, or the oil producing regions that led like the trucker crusade. They're proud Canadians. They are not amused by having heavy tariffs laid on them or being invited to be the 51st state. So it's kind of interesting to see that backlash going on there, which is certainly against the overall agenda within MAGA world in order to spread the gospel of the far right and encourage those parties throughout the world. So it seems to be backfiring to a certain extent within Canada. That being said, Liberal Party, like every incumbent party that's held a lot of power during the COVID period, during inflation, is in a lot of trouble. So pivoting back, so finally, I think they're getting to the meat, probably the most critical foreign policy challenge being faced by the Trump administration certainly is the end game that we've certainly discussed a lot over the last 3 years. And we had, a couple different events last week, but I think everything was overshadowed and shaped by Trump's phone call with Putin. And I think what struck everybody was what Trump seemed to give up within the negotiations. We, of course, know Trump as a master negotiator, evidence being, of course, his classic, The Art of the Deal, and then his master stroke that he negotiated directly with the Taliban on Afghanistan withdrawal, which went tremendously well, I think, as we all recall.
Wait, didn't he solve the North Korean problem too?
He did. And they exchanged some very affectionate letters between them. And my understanding is that, North Korea gave up its nuclear weapons and everything's cool now.
Wow.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
that is how it ended.
Somehow none of that happened, but...
So, I think everybody was left scrambling with the perceived repercussions of this phone call in which Trump agreed to go over the head of both leaders within the EU and Zelensky and his administration and negotiate directly with Russia on a potential peace plan. This, at the same time of this phone call, you had the Munich conference where you had all the leaders within NATO meet. J.D. Vance gave a very fiery speech, mostly focused on culture war issues around the perceived suppression of the right within Europe, particularly around speech issues and around immigration. Was very vocal in supporting far-right parties within Germany, which, of course, Elon Musk has previously thrown in his support towards the AfD, so the Alternative for Germany, or for Deutschland, which has Nazi sympathies and apologists within and have been targeted by the German intelligence as a red flag. So all of this was kind of going on. Within that same message, Vance, of course, delivered what every administration has delivered probably over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, is that Europe is not pulling its weight and that you can't rely on the United States for defense. It seems like maybe that message is finally beginning to sink in. I think European leaders maybe thought they could through diplomatic language alone and giving in certain ways that they could work with the Trump administration, but it seems less likely, particularly, I think, because of the result of the phone call and the implied that they would not have a seat at the table. Now, that being said, there's a lot of confusion and communication. What we're seeing this week is a meeting in Saudi Arabia between U.S. and Russian officials. It's not the meeting between like Trump and Putin directly, but instead, like the U.S., for instance, is seeing Waltz, the head of national security, and then Rubio, or Secretary of State.
What's really striking about this is that Europe and Ukraine are not there, just the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, and the confusion was that you have U.S. officials saying that Ukraine was invited, but then Ukraine didn't know about it. It wasn't prepared to send anybody on such short notice. So effectively, Ukraine does not have a seat at the table. There's been other people and kind of backtracking around that, saying this meeting is just to find out if Russia is serious. Of course, Ukraine has to have a say within the final settlement. But obviously, with the previous history between Putin and Trump, with the contents and what Trump tweeted on Truth Social, that there's obviously a lot of fear and skepticism that the worst case scenario is going to happen, that Ukraine will effectively be thrown under the bus. And what will emerge is such a compromised state that even if Kiev is left standing, that in the long term, it's giving up Ukraine to a new Russian sphere of influence.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. And just how Trump in that call too wants to bring Putin back into the fold instead of we've been trying to isolate him, make him a pariah for this invading territory and trying to gain territory through force, to try to set an example to the world that that's not okay by ostracizing Putin. And now Trump wants to bring Putin back to the United States, wants to visit Putin, wants Russia back in the G20. So I think all of that is pretty disturbing, but maybe fits within Trump's view of, this expansionist foreign policy is totally legitimate.
Yeah, all of that is concerning. All of that has definitely created great concern within our, former European allies. I don't know. I mean, it is mixed messages because you did get encouraging signs, both from what Vance said at the Munich conference and from Hegseth in terms of there isn't the absolute worst case, because people were saying, well, what if we pull out of NATO? There certainly was not any indication of that. Hegseth also framed the potential settlement, which we had previously talked about and kind of called the Vance plan, which essentially freezing the current lines, establishing a 600-mile-long demilitarized zone, and then that zone is actually patrolled by a European force, so a non-NATO European force. It would still have NATO members. For instance, the UK has probably been the most vocal this past week in saying that, yes, we would dedicate UK troops and a manning of this new DMZ. Doesn't support the condition of what Russia wants to see, of the complete de-armament of the Ukrainian military and its commitment of being banned from NATO. That being said, what essentially kind of Trump, Hegseth, and Vance are more or less on the same page is NATO is off the table, so no NATO membership for Ukraine. And also the original Ukrainian goals of getting back to a pre-2014 borders is also off the table. And a lot of people, including Ian Bremmer, have pointed out that everybody knows that because of opposition from Slovakia and from Hungary, that NATO membership, at least as the current political arrangement is off the table. And it's not realistic. Just the where the battlefield is, the failure of the counteroffensive, Ukraine's not going to be able to get to its territorial goals. That being said, giving that up front doesn't really seem like a art of the deal sort of approach. It's like You're giving up way too much in advance. To me, and kind of the consensus that I'm seeing is that it's kind of a mixed bag where things are now. We have to wait to see more details. We have to wait to see how the conversations in Saudi Arabia go this week. But on the positive side, it seems like we're still in NATO.
Okay.
We're still in NATO. The other thing that Hegseth said, he said, yes, U.S. troops wouldn't be on the ground in Ukraine, but made no mention of what's really key, the logistics, the intelligence,
Right.
all of the support, air support, all of the things that would be critical even to a European mission of NATO members on a non-NATO
Right.
non-NATO mission
Right.
in Ukraine. And then the other interesting part, which a lot of people have read positive signs into, is this whole, people erroneously calling it a rare earth mineral deal, because rare earths is a specific category, and Ukraine does not have a bunch of deposits of that, but it does have rare minerals, which include things like titanium and uranium, and pretty significant deposits to a point where their total reserves within the country are estimated at $3 trillion. And what Trump has proposed, and actually had the Treasury Secretary try to get a memorandum of understanding signed by Zelensky during the Munich conference, was to sign over 50% of the ownership of those mineral rights to the U.S. as, and this is unclear because, again, it's the Trump administration, so nothing is very clear, but to pay one for the under $100 billion in total aid that's been provided since 2022, and then also potential future aid for Ukraine going forward. But the thing I think people looked at it positively was that, hey, it's a transactional approach. It was something Ukraine had proposed actually back last year as part of their victory plan. And it's something that will materially tie Trump and the United States to the defense and long-term success of Ukraine. And it's something that he can say he got a win out of. Now, Zelensky wisely and probably legally did not sign any sort of memorandum of understanding, signing away 50% of the country's mineral wealth to the United States. But it's something they are looking to continue to talking about and discussing.
So I read that Zelensky rejected the deal. If Ukraine originally proposed it, why are they rejecting it now?
They didn't propose it for 50%.
Oh, okay.
It's the terms. Yeah. It's the negotiate. And I think, that's fine. Trump's going to go very aggressive. I think he even cited $500 billion. I mean, there's a lot of things to look at. I don't know exactly what it gives U.S. companies the exclusive rights to develop these areas, and then they have a profit-sharing agreement where the net profits are then split between Ukraine and the U.S. at 50%. I don't know. It's a very aggressive, because they're saying, well, this could be worth like $500 billion. The U.S. has sunk under $100 billion. And again, we've talked about before, it's not that it's sunk into it. A lot of this is recirculated back into the U.S. defense industry. So the amount actually going in pure aid to Ukraine is probably much smaller. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty 19th century colonial move. Mm-hmm. And it's the sort of thing he is known on why we were suckers in Iraq. Why didn't we? And of course, the left always accuses the U.S. of having stolen the oil reserves of Iraq. He wants to do it legit. Yeah. But I think it's, if they can come to a reasonable arrangement, and it keeps the U.S. engaged, that feels like a victory for Ukraine in that sense.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you did end with some positive signs, even though overall I find it more than a little concerning.
I think the way to look at it is that so far we're avoiding the worst case scenario. Just the full pulling out of NATO, throwing Ukraine completely under the bus. It doesn't seem like it's heading in that direction. Obviously,
I love how you're positive is just avoiding the worst case scenario.
It is. Well, domestically, did you feel like...
Well, we are in the worst case scenario.
Right, yeah. So I feel like there were concerning signs, obviously, but nothing surprising, nothing that hasn't been telegraphed previously by the Trump administration. So no big surprises. And then seeing them still engaged, not pulling out of NATO, not talking about dismissing any sort of support for European forces in a DMZ, and saying that, yes, Ukraine needs to be part of the conversation, not Europe. Europe's in the doghouse. They have no say, I think, in this peace deal, but I think Ukraine will be at the table.
Yeah, I certainly hope so.
Yeah, no, it's insane. And I think, Zelensky, as the point said, any deal that's negotiated without us is going to be viewed as illegitimate. So you have one party that's not going to agree with it anyway.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, Trump has also been busy with his trade wars, which did start from the beginning of taking office. So the tariffs that he has imposed so far is a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports, include shutting down the de minimis loophole, which basically, if you were sending goods of a small value, then they did not have tariffs applied to them. This is particularly applies to when you order from Temu or Shein, those sort of goods, there was no tariff applied to. And now there will be, which is causing all kinds of problems for them since they're known as for just extraordinarily being very cheap. I was reading the other day that they're trying to get their producers to shift production to Vietnam. Beyond China, he's also imposed a 25% tariff on all foreign steel and aluminum. This is effective on March 12th. Aluminum tariffs are being raised from 10% to 25%. Ends all the previous exemptions negotiated under Trump 1.0 and Biden. And just kind of perspective, 44% of all aluminum is imported. The transportation sector will be most impacted by increases in price. Steel tariffs remain at 25%, put in place by Trump 1.0. And this has been estimated for every job saved or created is costing $900,000 per year cost to taxpayers. And 80% of steel imports currently have no tariff thanks to waivers under Trump 1.0 and Biden. He also then imposed right away 25% tariff on all Mexican and Canadian goods, but this has been delayed for a month based on concessions around border security. These concessions appear to be troops on the border that were already there to begin with.
Yeah, so probably some clever positioning by Mexican and Canadian leadership there, but only buying them a month, which is coming up pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then, yeah, obviously the impact of reciprocal tariffs coming up.
Yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? This is very extreme, something we talked about. We talked about Project 2025, and now is something that has actually come to fruition.
Yeah, so this is all coming from an executive order released by the White House on Thursday, which directed Trump's advisors to come up with, new reciprocal tariffs. And essentially that's going to mean adjustments over 4,000 different import categories and 150 countries. And kind of what makes it unique is that it's not just adjusting for differences in tariffs, which is certainly one thing and had been previously negotiated under various rounds of the WTO. But it also takes into account foreign taxes that are charged on U.S. imports, on any sort of state subsidies to specific sectors, and to exchange rates, and basically any other unfair behavior that is determined by the White House and its officials. I think in particular, it has a strong focus on the value-added tax by the EU. And I think the value-added tax is probably around 15 to 20% on all goods sold within Europe internally. And it's just that disparity between U.S. car has this extra 20% tax on it because of that versus European cars sold in the U.S., which has whatever the normal sales tax is by state. There's no federal tax beyond the tariff of coming in. And that, just on the tariff side, for instance, what the Trump administration is complaining about and kind of what they point out on specific products on cars. So it's a 10% current tariff for U.S. cars in the EU versus a 2.5% tariff for European cars in the U.S. So this is very complicated what they're being asked to do, especially all these other factors. And I would think probably a little bit subjective too. But they're coming up with tearing down essentially the current trading system and established by the WTO where all of these tariff rates were negotiated. The New York Times had a really great article that we're using a lot of the supporting information, and it provided a map of like what the average tariffs were across countries. Now, of course, it differs by sector because each country has its own goals in regards to which sector, because everybody's driven by domestic politics and what they want in terms of the future development. But you can see that the overall tariffs and averages between countries are pretty low in the developed world and a little bit higher in the developing world. But certainly far down kind of what they were especially prior to the 90s, when I think they dropped significantly. And that's been a big boom for
average tariffs dropped to 2 to 3%. Developing countries get a little bit more leeway to have higher tariffs because they're developing countries, and it's recognized that they should have a little more protection of their industries. One of the problems with that, though, is China, which is considered under these rules a developing country and is sort of given them that advantage. But otherwise, it's pretty reasonable. And again, with average tariffs being 2 to 3%, obviously they're not these onerous tariffs being placed on U.S. goods. And it's really, really disturbing. I mean, the current WTO trading system, emerged out of World War II, Bretton Woods, in order to avoid the type of fighting that happened for countries to feel like they are going to gain something economically by war, to create more integration of societies, countries. And there's all kinds of consequences for destroying this. And I don't know if there's a way, if this all goes through, if there's a way to get back to that trading system. I'm also a little confused because when we talked about it through Project 2025, our understanding was that it would require an act of Congress to be able to do this, since you're getting rid of all these trade negotiations that they had to approve of. Certainly in the first administration, they pursued a congressional bill for reciprocal tariffs. So I don't know why now Trump is able to claim this authority that we really thought that he wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, that's a good angle. I mean, I think with a lot of what's going on is he's testing the boundaries of executive power and authority and waiting for either Congress to push back, which has been very, very reluctant to push back on anything, and the judicial branch, which I'm not sure the judiciary would have any sort of input around kind of trade laws and negotiations. So it seems like, what you're saying is it's up to Congress to actually enforce its prerogative and authority in this area. Because otherwise he's saying, hey, he told Howard Lutnick, Trump's new Commerce Secretary, to have these measures ready by April 2nd.
This to me also seems impossible. So just think about it. It's every good you're having to be analyzed from, 180 something countries. I forget how many exact countries there are recognized. And doing it not just based on tariffs, but all these other factors, and many of them, which you would have to guess at, like state subsidies, I just don't know how you do it in practical terms.
Well, you don't do it well. You can certainly put something in place, but it's going to err on the side of like the most extreme interpretation of, especially when you get into areas like, I would think, around how a state subsidizes, how much is that worth? Like an additional for each area and sector. Probably the data that you're basing it on in developing countries is going to be really poor.
Yeah, we don't have good trade data, period, right?
Yeah,
this is a huge problem. And then who carries out these customs? Like the people in customs now have to evaluate every good by a different tariff rate. You need a lot more people to do that at a time when the government is being cut down extremely.
Come on now. We've forgotten about our Doge Bros. They're going to slap up that algorithm, help calculate and figure out all the little tariff adjustments, and you won't need to hire anybody.
I know that's what they would say, but in practical terms, it just seems like the people who are handling imports
It seems like a big increase in bureaucracy and an impediment to U.S. businesses, for sure. Just from the mind-boggling uncertainty. You're going from the system with these negotiated rates, which, had a system for negotiation until the U.S. abandoned it under the first Trump administration. I mean, what I didn't realize, the WTO has effectively been dead since
the dispute mechanism,
right? The dispute mechanism, but not the not the previous agreements. They're still obviously being carried out, but there's no means of enforcement. So it's kind of dead in the sense that you could do whatever you want because there's no legally binding way to challenge it between countries anymore.
So kind of just reviewing some things we brought up in Project 25. I mean, the idea that they think what will happen is this will completely eliminate the trade deficit with each country. But instead, it'll just shift trade around. I kind of gave an example about Brazilian and Mexican cars, whereas Brazilian cars were the cheapest, but had higher imports on U.S. cars. So in actuality, then it just shifted to Mexican cars. This is not a great example, but just the one that popped in my head. And so instead of Brazilian cars, you import Mexican cars, which are still, even with the tariffs, a lot cheaper than American cars. Again, not the best example, but this is how it works with goods. You would still have places that are cheaper, even with slightly higher tariffs. All this is really going to do is kind of create a mess and possibly, or almost certainly, to raise costs on goods, which is kind of interesting in a time where inflation is actually ticking up. It's not what you would think that you'd want to impose higher prices on goods. And this is because countries with this tariff being imposed, these companies who are actually paying the tariffs to the government then just raise prices to cover the cost of the tariffs. And I brought up some studies that showed that at least 80% of tariff costs are passed on into higher prices for the consumer. The one number that I found when we were talking about this was the American Action Forum said that it would cost $60 billion per year, approximately $500 to each American household, without taking into account possibly raising tariffs to retaliate, other countries raising tariffs to retaliate. But essentially, this number is really unknowable because of how complex the system is. And we're completely upending the trade system that happened since World War II. So there are some potential really grave consequences of this.
Yeah, and I guess, it's kind of interesting seeing how they frame in the issue. Because, of course, during the campaign, the focus was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to be able to bring down grocery prices and prices of everything and interest rates and all of that, almost instantly. But as soon as you're sworn in, it's, this is going to take a while, or, there's going to be some pain. The theory, like you said, is that you have these tariffs in place. It's going to initially punish the U.S. consumer, but it's going to create conditions to bring back jobs. I think what we saw from the steel example is that, it brought a handful of jobs, but when they cost $900,000 a year per job and the people being employed, maybe put in $150,000 back into the economy through their wages and benefits, that doesn't seem like such a good economic prospect. And certainly with automation and technology, these things coming back, it's just the math doesn't seem to be mathing on this long term.
That's just for the steel tariffs. If we extrapolate that.
Right. I'm just saying, for every concept of it, because this is all designed to bring back American manufacturing, right?
Yeah, presumably. Or, Trump is also just obsessed with erasing the trade deficit. But I guess you would have to create jobs here to be able to sell goods here, because otherwise then you just have less goods.
And they're very expensive.
To totally eliminate the trade deficit.
Right.
Ideally, but we haven't really found, certain studies have not found tariffs in general. Maybe they did save some steel jobs, but in general, they have not brought back manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs declined under Trump overall. And so it's unlikely to see a significant shift. even with reciprocal tariffs, there's still reasons why goods would be cheaper in other countries. And so you might just shift around trade to different countries, but it's very unlikely. I mean, it's almost impossible to see how it limits a trade deficit, especially since trade deficits are mostly caused by the amount of investment you have in your country, which then gives you money to buy foreign goods. If you have all this money coming into your economy, it's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of this, but definitely the negatives will be higher prices for everyone.
Yeah, no, it was a great quote from Pat Toomey, who's a former Republican senator from Pennsylvania, saying, yeah, the logic of reciprocal tariffs is if another country punishes its consumers, we have to punish ours. So I get the China angle and having it targeted toward China. What I don't get is this blanket shotgun approach towards all of our allies. And yeah, I don't get it. I don't get this theory. You can't bring back the period right after World War II when the entire industrial capacity of the world was destroyed and the U.S. stood alone. You're not going to bring back the 1950s. I don't understand why there's any belief in this. It's not like there's some sort of 50-50 split amongst economists on this topic. Right. I feel like maybe it's not the climate change, the 97% of scientists support evidence, but it's something along those lines. And yet this seems to be the full direction that we're going in.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to fully grasp the consequences of doing this, how it will affect prices, but how it affects the trading system more generally. I think everybody's trying to, from what I've read, truly grapple with that.
Yeah.
I mean, this could be one of the most consequential
foreign
I think
that
things that
the
Trump does.
Other angle of it is that because the U.S. is largely driven by domestic consumption, that it has the leverage in this and we can force people to lower their own tariffs, that this is all kind of a threat and negotiation. And we'll just see these countries, wherever we have these particularly painful reciprocal tariffs, that they'll lower them in order to match ours and maintain it. I mean, I'm just grasping at like what the
that may be what the theory is, but it's unlikely to be practical. And I mean, if you just look at the free trade agreement we had with Colombia, which was probably one of the last ones that we signed, greater access for them to sell like agricultural goods and stuff. But overall, we ended up selling more to them than they sold to us. So a lot of these agreements have been mostly in U.S. favor if you look at the overall balance and not just good for good.
Mm-hmm.
So you're ruining things like that.
Yeah, and I think just because so many, particularly in developing countries, they have pretty high tariffs on agricultural because it's seen as kind of part of their national security. The U.S. has a big advantage because, I mean, we just have the scale and are largely industrialized farming. So we can outcompete, in a lot of cases, their agricultural sectors. And that's where I feel like we push, particularly like around China. I mean, that was a lot of the discussion during Trump 1.0 is, getting increased soybean or pork or whatever. So, yeah, I think to that point, that's where it's not going to be successful because these countries have national security reasons on wanting to protect their agricultural sectors.
Yeah, so kind of a nightmare. And we'll just have to see how it all plays out. So also, on just the so unbelievable side of things is that since January 20th, when Trump first took office, he signed an executive order that put a 90-day freeze on all foreign aid to assess programmatic inefficiencies and consistency with U.S. foreign policy. First of all, to do an audit, you don't need to stop all aid. And this is life-saving aid. This is also aid that is very much in our geopolitical interests. So some waivers have been granted, such as foreign military financing for Israel and Egypt and emergency food assistance. Additionally, on January 28th, Rubio announced that he had issued an emergency humanitarian waiver that allows implementation of existing life-saving human assistant programs. However, details are scant on what actually qualifies under this waiver, especially with most of USAID, which carries out much of this work on administrative leave. Beyond that, contractors around the world were required to fire staff, close operations, sell their equipment, and step away from their life-saving work. Organizations that work with U.S. on these life savings, like some of the UN projects, say that when they call the United States, nobody will tell them if their program qualifies or not, and that USAID is very strictly given instructions to not tell anyone. So life-saving programs have been closed and really unclear which ones qualify to be reopened or if they're staffed to reopen them or how they're being carried out. Other programs, such as the President's Malaria Initiative, TB, maternal and child health, nutritional activities, all those things have not been granted any waivers. Some key facts is that the U.S. spends less than 1% of its GDP on foreign aid, which is smaller than many other countries. But it's true because of the size of the economy is the largest overall donor of aid. I'm kind of emphasizing aid here because China has this huge role when it comes to investment, but those are usually in the form of loans. Aid from the U.S. is very geopolitical in nature. For example, the top 5 recipient countries of aid from the U.S. in 2019 were Afghanistan, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. So part of this has been the complete dismantling of USAID, which was called a criminal organization by Musk. I mean, these are people who carry out all these humanitarian, HIV, just truly life-saving emergency food assistance, which we buy millions of dollars in food from U.S. farmers that will no longer go to them. But I mean, just really critical work. And he's calling that a criminal organization. I mean, it's just makes me so angry. Most of the staff of 10,000 have been put on administrative leave or let go. Overseas staff, which compromises over 2/3 of the workforce, were given 30 days to return. Now, judicial rulings have put a pause on these orders to February 21st, but I haven't figured out what this means in practical terms because as far as I know, the people that I work with who are part of USAID are likely to not come back and are not present. So the idea in a memo that Reuters had is that the goal is to whittle the organization down to about 600 core staff. So there's a lot of information that went around about USAID and coming directly from the White House itself. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said to reporters on Tuesday that USAID had spent $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces, $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland, $47,000 for transgender opera in Colombia, and $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. Not only are these like tiny, tiny amounts, but they are misrepresentative of the actual programs. And the latter 3 are not even USAID. They were awarded under the State Department's Office of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. So, it's bad enough when you have misinformation on social media coming from other sources, but when it's coming directly from the White House, what are you supposed to trust? So there's huge national security implications from this. You have the intelligence gathering that goes on through these organizations in these countries. But most prominently, you have other countries that will step into this gap, such as China and maybe even Russia. Already, China is promising to step into areas USAID is leaving. Nepal, the Cook Islands, and Colombia report that they have already been contacted by China with promises of financial assistance to fill the void. In general, China has used its economic might to heavily promote its interests around the world. One most famous example is just their investment in ports and being able to potentially have some military use if they needed to put military ships there and such. In Africa is a good example of how these economic relationships have spilled over into military implications. From 2008 to 2016, China's People Liberation Army, PLA, engaged in 294 interactions across 40 African nations. Of these, 259 were working visits held both in Africa and China, aimed at strengthening ties with defense leaders. Additionally, there were 22 naval port visits and 13 military exercises. I mean, I could go on because I've written about this and am writing about this, but the consequences for not only do you have just the basic humanitarian, which creates like goodwill toward the U.S., whereas in Africa, China has been increasing popularity, but the U.S. still also remains popular. But you have real national security concerns. We are ceding to China increasing economic influence, which I said has this military dimension that ultimately really damages U.S. interest across the globe.
Yeah, it's really, extraordinary seeing just kind of the targeting of USAID, which again has been around for, since the Kennedy administration. And like you said, is a critical arm of U.S. foreign policy and presence within a lot of places where, maybe they don't have a lot of like private sector investment from U.S. companies. And just seeing it targeted in this way and again, pushing the boundaries of legality. This was set up by Congress and has an express mission to carry out, around aid, around kind of coordination with other agencies, around national defense and intelligence gathering, and just seeing it dismantled and trying to frame this as like a reorganization or efficiency measure, which nobody could say you're going from 10,000 to 600. You're basically not fulfilling that mission anymore. It's impossible.
Which again, how are they able to do this when Congress set up this organization? It seems like executive orders should not be able to dismantle something that is a congressional mandate. But like you said, Congress actually has to exert its authority over these matters. Yeah. But it is one of the reasons why you do have these judicial rulings that have kind of stopped or paused some of this dismantling. But really disturbing and frustrating. Rubio said much of this aid does not fit into our foreign policy preferences, which is ridiculous because it is serving an important foreign policy role and interest. The majority of aid goes to, like I said, military, geopolitical partners. A smaller amount goes to humanitarian aid. And like I said, it's very, very much in our national security. And we're just going to cede all of that to China. And there are real consequences, right? It's not just about soft power. It is China's using this power for military consequences and expanding its military presence. Do we just want that? Are we just okay with that? This really hurts the U.S. interests in acting across the globe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the whole Doge campaign. The fact that I can't remember specifically if it was USAID that was auditing Starlink and some of the dealings in Ukraine. But it seems like many of these agencies are being targeted specifically by Doge because of Elon Musk. Enormous interest in government contracts and any agency that has gotten on his bad side. The FAA was targeted as well.
Which is crazy because the FAA is understaffed and he's trying to get rid of people.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it just seems like, and then there's no transparency around Doge. There's no accountability for Doge. This is the world's richest man with enormous ties and dependence on government contracts. And he seems at this stage to be co-president along with Trump. And the fact that his aim, which together with, again, there's this consensus of using Doge as a wrecking ball for Project 2025. There's definitely been things that probably since the Kennedy administration that hard right conservatives have complained about the organization. Foreign aid is always an easy target because it doesn't poll well. Many Americans think that we give away 10% of our budget to foreign aid. And like you said, it's under 1%.
It makes me angry too, because I was watching political analysts say this is not the hill for Democrats to die on because it's genuinely unpopular. It is so important, right? And I think there's a difference between just Doge's general wrecking ball across the government that we saw this past week with getting rid of so many probationary workers across different agencies, and having something that is being targeted not just by Doge, but by Trump's foreign policy team, I think is a little bit even more extreme.
Yeah, and what's shocking, I mean, it's not shocking. I mean, Rubio has, in his previous statements, pre-kissing the ring, has been very supportive of USAID because he understands, or did understand, the importance of that mission towards U.S. national security and soft power. But yeah, because it is being targeted, obviously, I mean, just the examples they give and the dollar amounts relative to the size of the budget, that gives you all the proof that you need, that they had to dig through. And of course, you're always
they're not even
they're
real
not
examples.
Even credible, right?
They're not part of USAID. They're part of the State Department.
Even if you take it on the surface that, okay, they want to get rid, they don't like the priorities under the Biden administration that they interpret as DEI, there's responsible ways of doing it. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, you do a proper audit of it. You remove these programs, defund these programs, but you leave the majority, which is so, like you've certainly made the case for, so critical to U.S. interest, and more importantly, to countering the malicious activities of the CCP abroad. It's outrageous. It's truly outrageous. And the U.S. is weaker because of it.
Trump's always talking about getting tough on China, and he seems to think tariffs are the main vehicle for doing so. But we're just ceding all these interests to China, allowing China to be a bigger and bigger global power. And who was it that said recently, since this all happened, that it's just natural that there would be other global powers than the United States? Like, we're not even trying to be the preeminent power in the globe. And how are we supposed to ensure our interests if we're not at least attempting that? I mean, of course, it's natural for China to want to have more influence in global affairs with a bigger economy, but we have to accept that a lot of the interests that they are pursuing are counter to U.S. interests. And we have to make sure that they're not just doing that unimpeded, that we are competing. And there's so many ways, like there's these unmet opportunities where a lot of the infrastructure projects that China has invested in, these countries go to the United States and IMF first and say, will you fund us? And it's only after we reject them do they accept Chinese financing. So if anything, in certain areas, we should maybe think about increasing our aid for infrastructure projects, which curry a lot of favor with the actual political elite. But this is crazy. This is outrageous for so many reasons.
Yeah, it really does seem like the U.S. is looking to be like the first. A lot of people, talk about the American empire, and there's a way. I think there's certainly a case that America does have an empire, not one of territorial ambition, but of power. Obviously, we have hundreds of military bases throughout the world, the reserve currency, kind of unprecedented leadership within science and technology. So for an empire, for lack of a better name, to give up willingly its primacy and not be forced into it because of war or because of economic crisis is truly unprecedented in human history. The British did not give up that empire willingly. They were forced to because of circumstances, because largely financially, consequences of World War II and the rise of the United States. But to see us cede this and to, presumably push towards a 19th century carving up of the world. I mean, I think that's the darkest interpretation is that Trump is looking to have a new Yalta agreement, essentially between China, Russia, and the United States, where we carve up the world into spheres of influence.
How are we carving up the world? China has all of it. I mean, in terms of, its infrastructure investments, what do we think that we are keeping that China doesn't already have.
I don't know. That's what the weird thing is that, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, I hate to tell you, but future economic growth's not in the Americas.
Also,
if you give
China
up Asia, you give up the world.
Much of Belt and Road projects are in Latin America. China is very deeply embedded
so they're
in these
already
economies.
kind of embedded in there. So kicking them out, I mean, good luck with that.
All we've ever done is say, don't take this Chinese money because it'll give them leverage over you. And they're like, but they're going to build dams and things like that for us. So we're going to let them do that.
Or in cases like what you said, and going back to the Panama Canal case, Betchel had actually had first dibs on managing the gate entry contract for the Panama Canal, but it wasn't economically interesting to them, wasn't competitive. So that's why the Hong Kong firm, which the Trump administration is using as leverage and saying why the US needs to take over. So it's not like we're not the person of first choice, it's just not attractive to US businesses.
Yeah, and so we have to think about, well, is profit, should that be the only determinant of our involvement in these projects? Or does it serve some greater geopolitical? I mean, if we don't care about China being the dominant player along with us, then I guess the answer is no. But if we want to maintain some supremacy, if we want to maintain being able to exert our own interest across the globe, then we should very much care.
No, it does seem like this is where you'll have like the QAnon and conspiracy on the globalist elite and things. But it does very much seem like the direction and what Trump admires, and probably Elon as well. And, it's the entire philosophy in kind of Silicon Valley. But yes, you have a economic elite that should rule over the world. And that you have more in common in that case with Russian oligarchs than you do with the average American.
But how does this make them rule the world? They're just giving it over to Chinese elites.
Yeah, but you're creating the conditions of disassembling the liberal world order so that human rights, all these things which never were perfectly enforced or never were perfectly championed, but served as the underlying basis, this rule-based order. And when you take all of that away, then corporations can maximize their exploitation of the working class. And then you have this condition, which essentially is creating like a neo-feudalism. And that is where they would share commonality with, certainly with Russia. China is a more complicated case where you do have a political power or a political party, which has the dominant power. And I feel like although she is, I assume, enormously wealthy, but not like Putin level wealthy. Right. I don't feel like it's as exploitive, or being a member of the party doesn't necessarily mean you're a billionaire.
Power. Yeah.
Is that true? I don't know.
I mean, there are a lot of really rich, like it's increased under Xi, I think, but like you, I don't know that she has accumulated outrageous amounts of wealth.
Yeah. Unlike Putin, who's thought to be probably the true richest man in the world because he has expropriated state wealth for his personal coffers. But that's the commonality in it, is this disassembly of liberal values and checks against unmitigated corporate or state power to accumulate wealth.
Yeah. And again, I guess it's about where, seeing where your interests lie. For me, I don't expect people to necessarily act out of the goodness of their own heart, but I expect them to be at least concerned about public interests, national interests. And certainly this sort of cabal of economic elites is not in the overall U.S. interest when it comes to security and other measures.
It doesn't seem to be that way, but it's very early on. We haven't seen direct talks with China. We don't know exactly what direction the administration is going to take in its dealings with China. Well,
I'm just saying that we're allowing China to exert more and more influence over the globe.
Yeah, certainly.
Talks are not going to...
Yeah, certainly around this issue. I want to see if it stands. I want to see if Congress discovers a backbone.
They won't.
I want to see that they'll just let kind of, yeah, I mean,
It will.
even if it's framed as a national, you won't get people nervous because that's the one thing. I mean, we've gone back to this. The one thing within Congress that there was general consensus between the parties was that the CCP represented an existential threat to the United States. To actually see them gain materially because of U.S. policy, you don't think there would be pushback against that? That'll be the one thing that if you see these gains that...
I mean, they've ignored these gains to a certain extent already. And I'm not the only one who's saying this is a national security threat. I mean, everybody's been writing about it. And they have not done anything to... I mean, there have been small measures to increase infrastructure aid, but they've been at a pretty small scale. But there was something set up under the Biden administration. But in general, this trend has been ignored, and I don't see why further gains by China will be more insightful to Congress to do something than if it already hasn't.
Yeah, but I guess it's just a big chunk. I mean, we are the single largest source of pure foreign aid. To see that taken kind of off of the table does create a pretty big gap beyond just the lack of infrastructure loans and investments.
Right. I mean, one of my arguments why infrastructure is so important is because it gives leaders to be able to say, give them a direct win. Like when we're working with individual groups and such, the leader can't say, oh, this is what I've done for the people. But when it's an infrastructure project, they can say, look what I've done for you.
Yeah, the infrastructure is very powerful because you see it, it's physical, it's real, it gets used every day.
Do we need both?
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see when China, as it steps in, if it will step in with pure developmental aid or if it will try to get something financially out of it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is really throwing China a lifeline because China is certainly in a very challenging situation economically and socially, given the youth unemployment, the demographic situation, and very much seems like it is stuck in perhaps even a worse version of lost decade conundrum that Japan found itself in the 90s and 2000s. So giving them this leash instead of kind of driving in a knife is a real shame. But I'm going to remain moderately optimistic because it's just less than a month in. And he's only now getting to kind of the big three foreign policy objectives: Ukraine, Middle East, and China. So I'm going to withhold judgment, although off to a bad start, obviously, with USAID and just its dismantling, frankly, for insane conspiracy theorist BS.
That's just the excuse. I mean, they just don't want it. I mean, the conspiracy theory is just an excuse. It's not the reason why they feel like they need to get rid of USAID. They don't believe in the mission. They don't believe in helping people.
Yeah. I mean, well, I can't argue with that. It is America first.
Yeah. So, I mean, as part of a broader, we don't believe in helping other people, even if it's these just real extreme circumstances. And, so Rubio a long time. Yeah, I think in the past I was reading Rubio had made this comment that, if people remain in abject poverty, then they can't become consumers. But just all the sort of ways, but they definitely don't want to do anything that is a largesse out of the goodness of their heart. But they're also willing to ignore all these national security implications.
I mean, none of this stuff is out of the largeness of our heart. I mean, this is to help maintain stability where we have interests. Like you said, it was targeted towards these countries like within the Middle East where, we have legitimate national interest. And, even within Africa, we've seen pretty big deteriorations because of failures from European powers like France, where Russian influence has grown dramatically in Central Africa. And maybe the only presence, was like USAID in these countries providing aid, and that's no longer there. So yeah, this wasn't just done. This isn't a charity. by any means. This is done out of
It's
U.S.
just kind of sad that we have no charitable spirit. But like you said, definitely not charity. And it's just the blindness of the Trump administration in general to what constitute national security. I mean, the way they're going through the CIA and the FBI and getting rid of probationary officers there who've been, we've been training them for, 2 years, and they're willing to just get rid of them. In all sorts of ways, they don't seem to care about national security.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. It's definitely some discouraging signs, but like I said, going to hold out judgment till we get a little bit more meat and evidence on the big topics.
Okay, but my judgment is it's all terrible and it's just trending worse. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on X at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email, so Nita at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com, and myself, Ryan at kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com. As always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.